Hey everybody, John Pollock here alongside John Ramdeen and Robin Black, and some news that is just coming out on Wednesday morning, courtesy of Ariel Helwani at MMAfighting.com, that it looks like George St-Pierre and the UFC are about to finalize an agreement that will see George St-Pierre return to the UFC, something that has been discussed very intensely over the past year, but it looks like we're very close now, and it seems a formality that George St-Pierre and the UFC will be back in business together. And looking ahead at this year, John, and the different issues that the UFC is facing, many of them of creating big fights, George is a big piece of that puzzle to create some solutions.
I'm not stunned or shocked at all that this is happening because A, the UFC needs fighters that are going to fill venues, that are going to garner the interest of the masses, and where they can make a lot of money. Again, because we don't know what's going on with Conor, we don't know what's going on with Ronda. Apparently Brock says he's done with mixed martial arts, so you need the biggest names possible to garner that interest to make that money. And George wants to fight. We were with George a number of months ago, and he's been training. Like, we were sitting at this amateur MMA fight. He could have drank beer because there was no deal in place. He's like, no.
Hayabusa was sure buying the beer.
That's right. Hayabusa set us up, and George's like, no. I'm happy with my Dasani because I don't know when I'm going to get this call for the UFC. He's been training, trying to reincorporate old tactics. You know, the guy's a black belt in karate. He says he wants to bring his karate back to the game of mixed martial arts. And when you think about some of the big name fights that you could have George St-Pierre a part of, I am not surprised at all.
George gave us a lot of details on exactly what was happening with the negotiation, which is interesting when two or three sources are saying we're very close to signing. Close is a very relative term.
Yeah.
And we had one good source tell us what was going on, George himself. And we didn't want to undermine his process because it was something he talked a lot about. He would send a message to so-and-so who would then pass it on to some person who would leak that thing. And it would wind up and affect his thing. But if it's getting close now, we can infer that it is a fork in the road that he was talking about at the time. There was serious conversation, and this was public, that the UFC felt they had to invest a bunch of money to get people to re-know George, to get them to reintroduce George. That's what WMG was saying. And George was like, well, I don't think that is so.
If you remember last June, I mean, that was a near catastrophe when they only had 4 weeks with Brock Lesnar. I mean, who could possibly have remembered Brock Lesnar?
Yeah.
I mean, that was, I was crossing my fingers that they'd be able to promote Brock Lesnar's return, because how would you possibly know who this guy is?
Exactly. And George also, at one point, we were sitting there going, because we are friends, and we were sitting there wondering, does he want us to pass out this information? Because maybe sometimes that helps with negotiation. We see Conor McGregor talking every day about a fight that's not happening, and every dummy is locking onto it as if these sources on Twitter are actual sources. Anyways, I digress. But one of the things George was talking about is, like, if this is such a risk for you guys, if you're concerned that people won't know who George is, then instead of giving me X amount of money, let's break it down instead, that I only succeed if you succeed. And instead, let's talk about a larger portion of the gate and a larger portion of pay-per-view. That way, if it turns out that people really don't know me, I'll take the loss. And that was his negotiating point. And if we are very close right now, that's been the difference. And that is how you make deals. If really there is a concern from the person you're making a deal with, and you believe that's not so, create a scenario in which you'll still make what you deserve, and they'll take less risk, and presumably that's what they're doing.
This also would signal that they cleared what I always viewed as a major hurdle, and that was this Reebok deal in place, because George has a very lucrative one with Under Armour, which, unless they have worked something out, whatever the agreement is, they were able to get through that, because that was a major issue here between George St-Pierre's last fight. Well, when he fought Johnny Hendricks versus now with this Reebok deal.
The easy way to fix that deal is Reebok, let's say, I'm making up a number at random, pays me $200,000. Now, because Under Armour pays me $200,000. Now, because Reebok only pays me $40,000, hey, I want the difference. You can just pay it. he's not going to be coming out in Under Armour. He's going to be coming out in Reebok, but they will have made up the difference to him. George was willing to make a deal. That was the key, and that's what we could tell. Not only was he training very, very hard and super focused on it, thinking about fights, thinking about opponents, thinking about all of those things, but he was willing to figure out how to get the deal done. Get what he deserves. He knows what that is, but find a way to get that in the context of risk is your issue, Mr. WMG. That's your okay. Let's give you less risk. I believe that the audience will come to see me, and I believe that he's right.
Now, when it comes to the fight that would make the most sense for George St-Pierre right now, Michael Bisping is certainly one that comes to mind. He just stated recently the fact that he's coming off that minor knee surgery. He said if he had to push it, he could probably fight in May, but ideally July would be, and certainly that's a big card to do International Fight Week, and he's put his cards on the table. Listen, I know Yoel Romero's the #1 contender, but if I'm offered a fight with George, I'm taking that fight for millions of reasons, and that's certainly an option that is going to be there. Do you like George fighting at 185 if that's the option?
100%. I mean, over the better part of the last decade, what is the fight that everybody was talking about? It was George St-Pierre versus Anderson Silva. So George was talking about 185 pounds then. Now he's 36 years of age, or 35 years old, closer to Michael Bisping's age. This fight makes 100% sense. When you think about it from George's standpoint, coming back to the UFC, they're going to give him the money that he wants. In addition to that, he has a chance to win a title in a different division. And same with Michael Bisping. He gets his chance to defeat another legend and continue to go down as one of the greatest, certainly one of the best, if not the greatest European fighters ever. But he's certainly cemented his place in mixed martial arts history.
Fighting changes so fast, faster than any other sport, because it's still earlier in its evolution. Baseball in its first 20 years changed a lot, still changing. But it changes faster at the beginning. Football, all of these sports, these are truths. And Michael Jordan, now what's it been, 10 years, Chase Warman, 10 years since that guy played? With George, maybe it's 4 or 5 years, but it's at least the same. How does Michael Jordan do in the NBA today? Realistically, against the athletes that we have now, just take him, make him older, and plop him in there. I don't know the answer to that. But I do know that it is a different game when George enters back into it. And Bisping has been acclimatized to this game. He's been existing in it. He's been facing the Luke Rockholds of the world. And George, his big challenge will be to catch up to what the game is doing, or to be able to go back and believe in what he does. People aren't landing a blast double leg off an overhand right anymore. It's just not working. The game has changed too much. The understanding, the sensitivity to these things has changed. You can't make that work. Or can you? If you were the best at it. Would Michael Jordan's jump shot still work? I don't know the answer to that. But it's a question that you need to ask. It's a question that George, Firas, their whole team really needs to address, because it is a different game. Bisping is bigger. Bisping is stronger. Bisping is fighting right now. The game is different. George has to. The thing about it is they will deal with those questions. They will deal with all of those realities. I'm starting to get excited now.
So based on that, does George, is he choosy? Is he specific about opponents? I remember reading this article about Joe Lozon. He won a bunch of fights. His contract expired, and he had the opportunity to take a new contract for more money. And the UFC says, yeah, we'll give you this new contract, but you can't turn down any fighters, and we're going to give you the best fighters in the world to face. Now, it's like, yeah, sure, I can face the BJ Penns and some of the top guys in the division, or I can take the same money that I was making before and focus on making the bonuses. And that's the route that he decided to go with. Does George St-Pierre, does he just say, you know what, I'm back in the game, whoever you put in front of me, I'll take on Stephen Thompson, I'll take on Tyron Woodley. We know that George will, but is the idea to take the
to me, if you're bringing back George St-Pierre, with all due respect to Tyron Woodley and Stephen Thompson, to me, it's like you have to be looking at the biggest fights possible.
I agree.
And above Bisping, the biggest fight possible is Conor McGregor at 170 pounds. That will be the all-time biggest purchase pay-per-view if they could put those together. And that's suddenly a bargaining chip the UFC has now to play with Conor McGregor and state, hey, you want a big fight? We now have a deal with this guy.
I'll go back even to that 3-hour sit-down we had with George. And George was talking about if he's coming back, he's coming back. He's not coming back to play. He's not coming back to make some money. He was talking about potentially, if he was going to come back for a few years with the 185-pound belt and the 155-pound belt. That's what George was
Bonkers.
talking to us about. I know that from speaking with Firas over the last number of years, their preference is 55. George was a 190-pound muscular man and when you go and he was solid.
Solid.
Yeah, he's in shape. But he can make 155 pounds. 190, Bisping's 210 by fight time, maybe more. Bisping's a big dude. You fight Conor McGregor at 155 pounds for that belt. All of a sudden, it's raining money.
And
That's $2 million buys easy.
Yeah. And for us, when the fight between Nathan Diaz and Conor McGregor, George St-Pierre happened to be at the fight, and for us was telling him, you have to call out the winner of this fight. Go out there. You're talking about big fights. People will be so excited, and you'll make more money than you've ever made in your life.
And they were at 170
I know,
even
they're
at the
170.
time, But George wasn't talking about pop in, pocket some money, wave to the audience. He was talking about embracing, really being in that moment again, and being a part of that thing. And if he was going to really make a run, he was talking
But
about
isn't that him
2 more
anyways?
titles. Yeah, I mean,
once he
that's
gets
the
into
thing.
he's not just going to half-ass it. We've seen that his commitment to mixed martial arts greatness has always been there. So it doesn't, even if he's decided, you know what, I'm just going to do 3 fights, you know he's going to be focused. And you mentioned it before. The idea, one of the fights he wants is Damian Maia. Now, is Damian Maia going to make you a whole lot of money? Probably not. I mean, George is the bigger name, so people are going to tune in to watch George. But the fact that he still wants to challenge himself, he saw what Damian Maia did to Matt Brown and to Carlos Condit, and he wants to test himself. He thought that Stephen Thompson would beat Tyron Woodley, and then Damian Maia would end up beating Stephen Thompson. So
that may end up being true.
Maybe.
End up being true. Wow. Yeah, you start thinking about it. You really start thinking about it. We've been talking about this off and on ever since we sat down with George. Just because a few people say it's close is just one of these bullshit terms, Oh, man, we might sign it. Hey, wait a second. What about this clause? Oh, and you back away from the table. Close. Maybe it's close, maybe it isn't close. But when you speak to George himself, you really spend some time with him. As somebody that he trusts, that he genuinely trusts, and you look into his eyes. If he is coming back, he is not fucking around.
All right, well, that is where we will leave it. With the latest on George St-Pierre, we'll continue to discuss later this week with any further developments on this story. For Robin Black, John Ramdeen, I'm John Pollock.